Before I begin, I would like to thank Megan, Dave, Marie for becoming Unitarian Universalists again. And the service is going to go over. I don't have a 5-minute sermon to give to you. So if you need to leave early, there's no walk of shame to this. Just get up and leave. We won't judge you. I'll assume my sermon was terrible and go home in despair. That won't happen. Years ago, I served a congregation in central Massachusetts, and I lived in the neighboring town of Clinton, Massachusetts. One of my congregants owned, or one of the congregants, I say people in my congregants, but one of the congregants in the church I served owned a styling salon only 2 blocks from my apartment. So I walked over every month to have her cut my hair. Her name was Anne. One day in her salon, I told her that I was always surprised by the friendliness that I encountered in Clinton. Strangers said hello on the streets when passing each other. Business owners downtown welcomed strangers when they walked into their shops. Despite the fact that the mills in town had drawn immigrants from Brazil and other places, people seemed to get along. This was in sharp contrast to other small New England towns in which I had lived before, where good fences made good neighbors, and attitudes excluded welcoming new people. As I sat there in the chair and Anne was clipping my hair, I said, "What makes Clinton different?" Anne paused a moment and said, "We remember what it means to be Irish. We remember what it means to be Irish." It took me a minute or two of silence to ruminate on what Anne said to me, to understand what she meant. When the Irish first came to this country, they were welcomed nowhere. In a New York Times op-ed column years ago, on St. Patrick's Day, Fenton O'Toole wrote about the Irish. They were nobody's ideal of the desirable immigrant. The typical Irish Catholic arrived in New York or Boston was a peasant with little formal education and few material resources. Worse, these people were religious aliens, the papist hordes who threatened to swamp Protestant civilization and in ignorance and superstition subvert democratic American values. The Irish were made to feel unwelcome. As Anne said, though, we remember what it means to be Irish. She meant, we remember what it means not to be welcome and to struggle to find a place in the larger community. We remember what it means not to be accepted, let alone affirmed for who we are. Anne felt that the memory of alienation stayed with the people in that town and moved them to welcome the stranger, to extend a welcome because they remembered its absence in their history. On this day, the Sunday before St. Patrick's Day, we remember that St. Patrick was, by his own description, despised in the eyes of many. He appreciated hospitality and taught that such was a spiritual value, excepting, of course, for snakes. In our times, our faith also teaches us that hospitality is a spiritual value. The Unitarian Universalist welcome at its best is extended to groups of people not welcomed into many other religious movements, people who do not fit the stereotype of church folk. We might think of those on independent journeys, those who are mixed in their theological views, those who are decidedly skeptics. All are worthy, all are welcome. This welcome means that we are actively welcoming the stranger and advocating for his or her needs. We are making a place at the welcome table. That means that we are advocating for a just and equitable society, and that is not a passive undertaking. We are here in this welcome to speak for those who cannot speak, to make the chair fit at the crowded table. This is the love that we show to those who are oppressed. It is our duty to press further and not to accept that this is the way things are, nor to believe ourselves better because we have been blessed or belong to the dominant society. And in this welcome, we also need to be silent at times, to listen, to permit the sacred other to speak, and through words or even in lack of words for that guest, to be real. Our hospitality must truly value the other and give that person or persons the courage and encouragement to be authentic and to be free. It means offering time and appreciation as well. Do we remember what it means to be Irish or atheist or African American or gay or a woman or poor? Do we let such labels define us in ways that cause us to forget that we must constantly reach out to the sacred other? Do we forget the struggles of others? American society is in need of the spiritual value, the spiritual practice of hospitality. Our nation is treating Mexicans, Muslims, transgender people, and others as if they did not belong. We're perhaps even worse to them than our ancestors were to the Irish. We've just expanded the number of people who are experiencing oppression. In response, Fintan O'Toole writes again, "We Irish are not know-nothings. We know something important, what it is like to be feared, to be discriminated against, to be stereotyped. We know from our family histories that anti-immigrant hysteria is found on lies and that over time these lies are exposed. Yesterday's alien is today's workmate. Yesterday's pariah is today's patriot. Our spiritual practice might call us to take a risk for the stranger and to believe that he or she belongs with us. Hospitality is not only a value for our community, but also for us as individuals. In the first ministry I served after seminary, I was the interim minister to a congregation in rural central Massachusetts. It was really rural, and there are rural places in Massachusetts. My apartment was in the Boston area, so I commuted to the church. Though it was not that far from my apartment, it was more practical for me to travel to that small rural community and stay 2 or 3 days a week. The parsonage was occupied by the widow of the previous minister. No inexpensive rooms could be taken nearby, so I stayed often in the homes of congregants when they were out of town. I really did not know where I was going to be on the Saturday when I was traveling to that town. Because no restaurants were nearby, I often ate at congregants' homes as well. Keeping an interim minister meant more for that congregation than just paying a salary. It meant that they had to practice hospitality. Now, being New England Yankees, some were practically shooing the minister out the door after supper. Others were warmly hospitable. I still remember the hospitality offered to me by a 3 or 4-year-old named Estelle. While her mother made supper in the kitchen, we sat in the family room. We talked for a few minutes. The conversation tapered off, and she asked me, looking up at me with these, we were sitting on the sofa, looking up with these big brown eyes. She looked at me and said, "Do you want to watch a potty training video?" So we watched a clown happily doing all the right things in a video. It struck me, though, that she was sharing where she was that evening, complete with what she thought constituted quality entertainment. Her hospitality was real, and I loved her for it. In our own lives, the spirit of hospitality might also be welcomed, sharing our lives and our bounty with others, opening ourselves to others different from ourselves, ensuring that no one is a stranger for long. In our own community, hospitality might mean welcoming fully the stranger or advocating for the rights of immigrants. It might only be a simple good morning to a stranger you pass on the street who is different from yourself. Hospitality was just as important in the early Christian churches. The early churches met in the homes of the wealthier members in those days. Those who offered their homes as house churches were usually women. In those times, one of the few skills that women were permitted was that of hospitality. It was more through hospitality that the early church thrived and grew than the permutations of Christian theology. The early Christians believed that it was their duty to recognize the sacredness in every human being who joined with them. They shared the food and wine that they had with strangers, and even more radically, the rich sat at the table with the poor. Nowadays, given the ever-widening gap between rich and poor, that still might be considered radical. 2,000 years later, we are still endeavoring to create the spirit that was with those early Christians even in our own culture, even if we are not Christians theologically. Those early Christians flung open the doors of their house churches and invited people to attend. They fed the hungry. They clothed the naked. They visited the prisoner. They treated every person as sacred, a child of God. Though they were challenged by a government that feared their spirit, they won converts, not through banging creed or scripture. Their success came because they practiced their faith. And their faith taught them to welcome the stranger. Now you might be thinking, why is Reverend Larry telling us about the early Christians? After all, most Unitarian Universalists do not consider themselves Christians. Some of us do. But being a Christian is only secondary to the description of the early Christians. The important element to their progress was that they lived their faith in practice more than in theory. I don't need to tell you, so must we. We cannot do so with pride. Otherwise, our efforts will seem condescending and our hospitality will ultimately fail. Rather, we must remember what it means to be Irish, to be Black, to be poor, to be gay, to be an atheist, to be a woman, wherever we are where we were not welcomed or treated as we should have been. Hospitality offered that remembers our own alienation from power or community. Hospitality that comes from our own recollection of what it means to be a stranger will authentically guide the spirit of our faith. In our own lives, the spirit of hospitality might be welcomed, sharing our lives and our bounty with others, opening ourselves to others different from ourselves, ensuring that no one is a stranger for long. Hospitality that encourages the stranger, hospitality that listens. Our hospitality might define us. We may startle people who are different from us with the warmth of our welcome. We may have the courage to be friendly, even when it seems risky. Inviting the new person and the new member is the role of a Unitarian Universalist congregation. Extending that welcome, that behavior of you belong here, is one of the points of our social justice advocacy. We want everyone to feel that there is a place for that person, and indeed to ensure that place is made for everyone to belong and to thrive. In closing, the early Christians were warned about welcoming the stranger into their communities. They knew that the stranger offered the opportunity for the community to be changed, for them to be changed. They knew that the stranger would challenge them. Conversely, they knew that the stranger might also be offering up a blessing unto their lives. Let us end today with the warning given by Paul of Tarsus, telling us of a possible consequence of hospitality. Know that this is a risk that you take when you remember what it means to be Irish. Paul writes, "Let mutual love continue. Do not neglect to show hospitality to strangers, for by doing that, without knowing it, some have entertained angels." Amen.